Hello, this is Socially Triggered, and this video is going to be on defending racism. Currently, we have a society that's been really pushing the concept of destroying racism, getting rid of it, rooting it out, removing any form of racism. And I want to defend racism because, in a way, I want to defend the indefensible. It's sort of like a lawyer who's commissioned with defending a murderer. And the reason they have to defend the murderer is for the greater good. Because if nobody defends that murderer, then the liberty and the laws themselves will not be executed properly. That due process is essential for the legal system. And that due process means providing a valid defense of even the most indefensible, which is the murderer. So I'm going to defend racism in that spirit, that if we want to have a society that is free of racism, then we must be able to express why we have to have that situation. Why is racism, why must it be eliminated? And I'm basically pleading for the life of racism, that it's on, death row in this case, and I'm trying to defend it. And, you can decide for yourself if we should have racism or not. And hopefully I'll give you arguments which will support why this disease, which we call racism, is not executed, or this racism is on trial, and I'm trying to be the defense lawyer for it. So first, we must understand who is racism, or what is racism. And I'm going to read you the standard definition, and I'm going to show you why racism isn't the plague or disease or the murderer that we know it to be. And maybe a death sentence is too extreme for such an innocuous and non-threatening thing as racism. Maybe racism doesn't deserve the bad rap that it has. So I want to first define it based on the definition, and we'll look at that. So the definition of racism is prejudice, discrimination, antagonism, directed against a person or people based on their membership of a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is minority or marginalized. I think that this is the recent definition where they've added that one that is a minority or marginalized. So but this is the definition that's on Google, and I'm sort of going to go with it, even though I can see that there's a bit of social justice thing going on there. So yeah, I thought that was really funny. The extra little minority or marginalized. Okay, so I just find that so hilarious. Oh man. Personally, I wouldn't add that extra minority part, but because racism really should be independent of whether you're minority or majority. If you think about it, what is even a minority? Are you saying a minority in this society? Well, how about in the world? White people, for example, are the minority in the world. If I go to Africa, can I, go around calling everyone the N-word? Because I'm a minority and therefore it's okay. And they can't be racist towards me because I'm a minority, or they can only be racist towards me, I should say. And I can't be racist towards them because I'm a minority. So I don't really like that last little piece on this thing. I just see it as very flawed. But I'll address the main parts of the definition. First is prejudice. And what's prejudice at the end of the day? I admit I'm prejudiced, and I think probably most people are prejudiced. Prejudice is just, and I'll look up the definition of prejudice because I want to have a proper thing here. But prejudice is really just saying, well, it's kind of like discrimination in the respect that it's a it's opinion based on not based on reason. It's sort of like a gut feeling maybe, or um, that we just sort of have like a sense that, oh, this is not a good thing. And we can be prejudiced on many things. For example, certain food. Usually, like there's some kind of thing there where you say, okay, I don't want to eat this, and it might not be a realistic thing. It might be like, oh, because it looks kind of similar to something else that you've eaten that you didn't like, and you can be prejudiced towards it. For example, I'm prejudiced towards eating fish. I don't eat any seafood. Actually, it drives my wife crazy. Um, and I'm prejudiced towards eating seafood. I just can't do it. So if I see seafood, I say it's not for me. I see food, but it's not for me, and I just don't eat it. So that's my prejudice, and it could be because once I ate fish and got very sick, and that's my prejudice. It's so maybe a fish that I haven't tried, I wouldn't have that experience, but I'm prejudiced towards all fish. And the same can happen to even races, where people feel like, oh, this person, or you know, they did this bad thing to me, and therefore I'm prejudiced against people that kind of remind me of that person. And that happens. And that's not necessarily a good thing. I agree. Uh, but it's a natural thing. It's sort of a protective mechanism that we have as a species. We kind of try to avoid risks. So if we have a negative experience with something, we generally try to avoid re-experiencing that negative thing. So and we'll sort of have these prejudices based on things that will protect us. So, for example, if I see somebody wearing clothes that are kind of baggy, kind of their butts falling out, and they look like they're going to mug me, then I will generally stay away from those people. I will avoid the situation. And the truth is, it doesn't have to be a black person per se, but it could be a white person that looks like that as well. I generally assume the worst of them, and that's not fair, but it's the way it is. We have these protection mechanisms that if somebody looks shady, we generally avoid them. And sometimes this works against us, where actually the shady guy is not the bad guy. It's like the guy that looks like, your neighbor next door, like the friendly person could be a psychopath that kills you. Um, so sometimes they don't work, but for the most part, these prejudices actually act as a pretty good defense mechanism where, we can protect ourselves by, having some kind of alert system that says, hey, maybe this person we have to be a little bit careful of. And so then that's kind of why prejudice is kind of essential. The next one is discrimination. And this is a little bit more easier to say, hey, it's not a bad thing, because discrimination is really based on not subjective or objective reasoning, where you say, hey, look, I realize that, somebody behaving this way, if they act sketchy, then I will avoid them because they're acting sketchy, and I know that has negative consequences where they could potentially be a risk to me. We discriminate all the time in terms of the people that we choose to be our friends and the people that we choose to be not our friends. And we discriminate on many different things. It's actually a very important part of our lives that we discriminate, very frequently, because we only have a limited number of decisions that we can make, and not all of those decisions are the best decisions. So we have to discriminate and determine what is the best path forward. And that means not associating with everybody. That means not associating with people that could potentially put you at risk. So I'm very discriminatory in terms of the people I hang out with. And that's not racial. So far, none of these are racial. But let's put it to a racial thing. one of the things that I see in early childhood behavior is they will, children, when they're very young, will generally look at their parents as the world, right? They are very close to their parents. They're very dependent on their parents, and they have very little trust of anyone that does not look like their parents. So if your parents are white, well, then you'll generally trust other white people. If your parents are black, then you'll generally trust other black people, and so forth. We generally trust people that look like our parents. And the easiest way that we can say that, hey, they look like us, is that they are of the same ethnicity. And it's not just skin color. People that are of the same ethnicity will have similar kind of facial structures, and they'll look similar in other ways other than just skin. They always say skin deep, but it's more than that. So generally, it's something that is genetically embedded within us, that we have these kind of discriminatory behaviors, but they are designed to protect us. That we basically have like our in-group preferences, where we prefer people that look like us, and this is biological, and it can maybe come into the prejudice part as well, where we might not even know that that's part of us, but it is part of us. But discrimination also is useful, because we can find out that there are certain groups that are each group behaves differently, and if you kind of recognize that and understand different groups, then you can discriminate in a way that doesn't mean necessarily like treating them bad or anything. I didn't say hate them or anything. I just mean that you treat them differently, and I find that like the conversations that I have with white people are very different than the conversations that I would have with a black person. And I don't mean that in a negative way. Actually, in some ways, I prefer conversations with Black people, because of the fact that I find Black people are generally a little bit more open and more willing to discuss anything, whereas white people, they are very politically correct, and they're very nervous about talking about anything on certain issues. They get very, very nervous. So some ways I prefer those kind of conversations with Black people. It's just a thing, or people that are minorities in Canada. But that's a form of discrimination, that I'm being discriminatory in the way that I communicate with them, and it's not necessarily a negative thing in this case, and I don't see it as a negative thing, because I'm sort of catering the conversation to the interests of the person that you're communicating with. You have to sort of take an interest in what they're interested in. So you generally make the conversation, it's a two-way street. You want to talk about something you're interested in, but also you want to talk about something that they're interested in. So you kind of pick what kind of conversation would be best suited to that person that you're dealing with. And there's discrimination that happens within that. So, and it's racial. so that's like, so far I'm trying to show why racism, and this is a form of racism. I admit that this is a racist practice, but it's not a negative thing. And like, it could even be customs. Within different groups, there's different customs. For example, looking certain groups in the eye is considered very, very rude. Like, it's very rude to look at it. In white culture, it's very rude to look at somebody in the eye too long. And if you don't look at them in the eye, it can be considered very rude too. In other cultures, it's even more so, where, like, for example, Asian cultures, you're not supposed to look at an authority, like an elder, in the eye. And if you start doing that too much, they will think that you're very rude. So these cultural differences, that you have to be kind of discriminatory about the way you act with people, then if by knowing that, you can basically better get along with people. And that's really important, that we understand how people act and discriminate in our own behavior in a way. And we discriminate also in the way we choose friends and we choose acquaintances based on their compatibility with us. You want to deal with people that are much more compatible to you than, if you're constantly feeling that you have to compromise the way you want to behave, it makes things very awkward. And sometimes that's where a lot of these cultural differences can come into play. Cultural, ethnic, like I see culture and race as being very tied together. So the cultural issues can really make friendships difficult with different groups. Like there's can be some real like water and oil kind of situations where some groups just don't get along. There's nothing you can do. It's sad. That's the way it is. And I've seen this many, many times. And it's not just black and white. Actually, usually they get along better than some of these other groups. It's like I've seen like Koreans and black don't get along. Other groups like I have Serbian friends and like Slavs friends. It's like certain groups just don't get along, or Greeks and Turks do not get along. Very painful. Or Koreans and Japanese do not get along. Um, so there's certain groups that just don't work together, and that it's a shame. And sometimes they can still make friends. I mean, it's not that they are totally prejudiced or racist against that group. It's just that there are cultural differences that can cause problems, and for whatever reason, it just doesn't work. And I do believe that as a good society, we should try to confront our own prejudices and discrimination, and every so often test the boundaries of that, where we say, hey, I don't like fish, but maybe I should try it once in a while. I still not at that point yet, but ideally that's where we should go with this, that we test our boundaries. So yeah, so that's kind of two parts of the racism thing. Um, One other point within it is the next one, which is antagonists. Like that, they're trying to remove antagonism between the different groups. And actually, I kind of like the antagonism. When I was a kid, I remember the boys would be on one side of the class and the girls would be on the other side of the class. And, not like we would just sort of divide that way. And we would have like little battles, like where guys would make fun of the girls and girls would make fun of the guys. And it was kind of fun. And the same goes between schools. Like I had friends that went to one high school and I went to another, and there was always that kind of rivalry between the two schools. And in that rivalry there's excellence that gets formed because you're competing with them. You're trying to up them. You're trying to be better than them, and you try to antagonize them too, where you make fun of them. And a really good example of this is the Olympics. The Olympics is the highest form of this because you have all the countries gathered together in a very peaceful situation. The reason Olympics was formed was for peace, to bring people together. But at the same time, you have people cheering for their own people, and they're booing the other side sometimes, maybe not necessarily, but they're cheering their own, and there's that rivalry. You want your team to be the best team, and that rivalry, that antagonism, is actually a good thing. It brings out the excellence in all the people because they're pushing a little bit harder to be better than their competitor, to be better than that other person, that other tribe. Like we're all tribal. Um, so the point is, like, it's a good thing. It's a motivator. And if we didn't have that thing which makes us like compete with each other, well, maybe that would be a very sad thing. Where we wouldn't have those rivalries, uh, those things that kind of spur on emotion. Like I I like to joke with my friends all the time, and I'd make fun of them for what they look like, and they would do the same to me. It's like it's it's a mutual thing where I'm short and skinny, and they would make fun of me for that, and you're fat. No, it's like it's not that I was really truly insulting them or anything, but it's a joke. Things we joke about, something like that, you know, um, or even about race, we would joke about. I'm blindingly white, or you know, you're so black I can't see you at night. It's like things like that where we kind of joke about it, and it's not that we hate each other or anything like that, but we antagonize each other just to be like to have that kind of like spirit of connection and understanding of each other. And sometimes when you make fun of somebody, you really get to know that person. It's weird and doesn't make any sense. The logic of it still doesn't really make sense to me, but it's true. It's just the way it is. Like we when we sanitize ourselves, we kind of lose that connection. In a way, we being able to be antagonistic, or being able to just sort of say what we think because we think crazy stuff all the time is okay. And having that comfort level where we can say anything, or and say the stupid things or make fun of somebody, allows a greater honesty and freedom between us, where you can actually have a real bond with those people. And that's really important. But when you have this kind of sanitized language, sanitized situations where you have to fear that you might say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, or it can really destroy that ability to bond with those people that are different than you. And if you're really about fighting hatred or racism or whatever it is, you actually want people to be able to, bond as much as possible. And I see a lot of this anti-racism rhetoric is being very conducive to destroying bonds between people rather than building those bonds. So this to me is a very big problem with the concept of racism. That to me, I see it as something that's preventing the bonds between groups rather than helping people really form those tight bonds. And those are the three main things. That's really all there is to racism, according to the definition: the prejudice, discrimination, and antagonism. You'll notice in all three of those things, there is no mention of hatred. It's not that you hate people. You do treat them differently. You do, you do antagonize them, as I just explained, and you do discriminate and you act prejudice towards them. But that doesn't mean that those have to be bad things. So my point is, racism. Now that I'm the lawyer for racism and protecting it and defending it, is not the evil that we see it as. And maybe it should be not only seen as something that is not an issue, but it's something that we should protect because of the value that it does bring to our society. That having societies that do understand the different groups, do understand that each group is different and special and wonderful in its own way, is maybe actually a good thing. And sometimes you need a little bit of racism to make the world go round. So this has been my defense of racism, maybe not the best defense. And I'd love to hear your comments. Why should we get rid of racism? Like, why is it a bad thing and should be destroyed in every form? Or what would be your defense for racism? I'd love to hear people's feedbacks on this, because people are so scared to talk about this kind of issue. Like, to defend this is to defend the murderer. And I really think that sometimes it is a good thinking process. A thing that really allows you to sort of think about issues is to defend the indefensible. So I hope this has challenged you in some way, and I hope that you will respond to it and give me some feedback. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.